Lila was the youngest mechanic on the airbase, barely 20, with grease always smudged on her hands and a stubborn spark in her eyes. While others spent their evenings scrolling on their phones or heading into town, Lila found peace among the hum of engines and the scent of oil and steel. Machines made sense to her. They were puzzles that didn't lie, problems that always had solutions if you listened closely enough. It hadn't been easy earning her place here. Most of the other mechanics were older, seasoned veterans of the trade. They called her kid, teased her for her small hands and quiet voice. But Lila didn't mind. Small hands were good for getting into tight spaces, and a quiet voice meant she listened more than she spoke. And when something was broken, really broken, she could fix it. That was her gift. One late afternoon, after finishing her assigned work earlier than expected, Lila volunteered to clean out an old storage hangar at the far end of the base. Most people avoided it. It was dusty, cluttered with forgotten equipment, and rumored to house nothing but junk. But Lila saw it differently. Abandoned spaces always whispered stories, and stories were worth discovering. She pushed open the creaking metal doors and coughed as a cloud of dust swirled in the sunlight. The hangar smelled of time, dry air, rusting metal, and memories buried under layers of neglect. Broken crates, old tires, and faded tarps littered the corners. She rolled up her sleeves and started clearing it out, humming softly as she swept the floor and pushed aside heavy debris. It was while dragging an old fuel drum toward the exit that she noticed it, a large, uneven shape in the farthest corner, completely hidden under a thick tarp. It was larger than any vehicle she had seen stored here, and something about its silhouette made her heart skip. Curiosity prickled through her as she approached it. With both hands, she tugged at the dusty tarp. It resisted at first, clinging like it didn't want to reveal its secret. But with one final pull, the cloth fell away, and Lila gasped. Before her stood the rusted frame of a fighter jet. It was beautiful in the saddest way possible. The once proud aircraft was covered in corrosion, its paint peeling like dried skin. The wings drooped slightly, their edges scarred with time. The cockpit canopy was fogged and cracked, and weeds had crept through the floor beneath it, wrapping themselves around the landing gear as if trying to claim the forgotten machine for nature. Lila stepped closer, her boots echoing softly in the cavernous hangar. She reached out a trembling hand and brushed her fingers across the fuselage. The metal was cold and rough, but beneath the rust, she could feel strength, the strength of something that had once soared through the skies. "What happened to you?" she whispered. There was no answer, of course. Just silence and the faint creak of metal settling after years of neglect. But in that silence, Lila felt something stir deep inside her. It wasn't just curiosity, it was connection. She had spent her life fixing broken things, from small engines to entire vehicles, but this was different. This wasn't just a machine. This was a story waiting to be told. She circled the aircraft slowly, inspecting it from every angle. Despite the years of decay, the bones were still strong. The engine, though ancient, might be repairable. The wings, though battered, could be reinforced. Even the cockpit, clouded and cracked, might yet hold life again. It would be a monumental task, far beyond anything she'd ever attempted. And it wouldn't be part of her official duties. She'd have to work on it in secret, after hours, when no one was watching. Most of the other mechanics would laugh at her for even thinking about it. But Lila didn't care. She felt it deep in her gut, that unexplainable pull she always felt when faced with a broken thing worth saving. And this fighter jet was worth saving. That night, she returned to the hangar with a flashlight and a small toolkit. The base was quiet, the sky outside painted with stars, but inside the hangar, Lila's heart raced with purpose. She climbed up onto the wing, pried open an inspection panel, and peered inside. Dust and spiderwebs greeted her, but beyond them, she saw potential, a maze of wires and circuits that once roared with life. Piece by piece, she murmured to herself, smiling. Bolt by bolt, it became her secret ritual. Every evening after her shift, when the others had gone home, Lila slipped back into the forgotten hangar. She cleaned and cataloged every part. She scraped off rust, polished metal, and replaced corroded wires. She scavenged spare parts from the scrapyard, trading favors with older mechanics for outdated tools and manuals. When she didn't know how to fix something, she taught herself, reading late into the night, watching old maintenance footage, sketching diagrams until the solution clicked. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the fighter jet began to change. The dull, lifeless frame started to shine beneath her hands. The wings straightened, strengthened by new supports. The engine, once nothing but a block of rust, began to look like an engine again. Some nights were harder than others. There were moments when bolts refused to turn, when circuits wouldn't respond, when exhaustion weighed heavier than the wrenches in her hands. But each time, she wiped the sweat from her brow and kept going. Because this wasn't just about fixing a machine anymore. It was about proving something, to herself, to the world, maybe even to the jet itself. She started talking to it as she worked, telling it about her day, about the people on the base, about her dreams of flying one day. "You and me," she'd whisper, tightening a bolt. "We're going to get you back in the sky." Sometimes she imagined the jet listening, remembering the roar of its engine and the rush of wind under its wings. Sometimes, she could almost feel it responding, as if it wanted to fly again just as much as she wanted to help it. And deep down, Lila knew this was more than a restoration project. This was a calling. She didn't know who had flown this jet or what battles it had seen. She didn't know why it had been abandoned, forgotten like a relic of the past. But she did know one thing. No machine that had once soared so high deserved to die in silence and dust. One evening, after weeks of tireless work, Lila stood back and looked at the jet in the golden glow of the setting sun. It was still far from complete, the engine hadn't roared yet, the cockpit was still empty, but it looked alive again. Not whole, not yet, but alive. And for Lila, that was enough. She rested a hand on the cool metal and smiled softly. "I'll get you flying again," she promised. "No matter how long it takes." The hangar fell silent once more, but it was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the silence before something extraordinary, the silence before rebirth. And though Lila didn't know it yet, this forgotten fighter jet would change her life forever. The sun had barely set when Lila slipped into the old hangar again. The fighter jet stood waiting in the fading light, its rusted skin now gleaming faintly after weeks of patient work. It was still far from ready, but to Lila, it already felt alive, a sleeping giant, stirring slowly under her care. She climbed up the ladder to the cockpit, wiping the glass with a cloth until she could see inside. Every wire she'd replaced, every bolt she'd tightened, had brought her one step closer to a dream she wasn't sure she fully understood. She didn't even know the aircraft's designation, the serial number on its side had faded long ago, but she spoke to it like an old friend. "You're looking better every day," she whispered. "Soon, you'll be ready to fly again." The hangar door creaked suddenly. Lila turned, startled. Hardly anyone ever came here. The others thought the place was a graveyard for forgotten machines. But this time, someone had wandered in. An older man stepped into the dim light, tall, with a slight limp and a weathered face lined with years of service. His uniform was neat but old-fashioned, the kind Lila had only seen in photographs. He walked slowly toward the jet, his gaze locked on it, his eyes softening with every step. For a moment, he didn't even seem to see Lila. He just stood there, staring at the aircraft as if he were seeing a ghost. "Where did you find her?" he asked quietly, his voice low and rough, like an engine that hadn't started in a long time. "She was here," Lila said, climbing down from the cockpit. "Under a tarp. No one seemed to remember she existed. I've been trying to fix her." The man took a deep breath and placed a trembling hand on the fuselage. "It's been years," he murmured. "Decades, even. I thought they'd scrapped her." Lila watched him carefully. "You know this jet?" The man smiled faintly, though his eyes shimmered with something deeper, sorrow, pride, memory. "Know her," he repeated. "I flew her, back when she was the sharpest thing in the sky." He turned to Lila then, and in the fading light, she saw something profound etched in his expression, a weight only those who had lived through war carried. "My name is Captain Harris," he said, extending a hand. "I was a pilot here, a long time ago." Lila shook his hand, feeling the rough calluses of someone who had gripped controls in life or death moments. "I'm Lila," she said softly. "I'm a mechanic here now. And I think your jet still has life left in her." Captain Harris chuckled gently. "She always did. Tough old bird." He walked around the aircraft slowly, touching its wings, its nose, its battered tail. With each step, his posture changed, shoulders straightening, eyes brightening, as though each piece of metal unlocked a forgotten memory. Then he stopped near the left wing, pressing his palm against a scarred patch of metal. "Right here," he said, his voice distant. "Took a hit over the eastern ridge. We were outnumbered 6-1. I thought we were done for. But she held together. She brought me home." Lila listened silently, captivated. She'd always known machines had stories, but hearing them spoken aloud, Hearing how this forgotten fighter had once saved a man's life, gave the jet a soul. Why was she left here? Lila asked gently. If she was so important. Captain Harris sighed and lowered himself onto a nearby crate. Time, he said. That's why. Technology moves on. Newer, faster planes replaced her. She was too old to fight, too outdated to upgrade. So they pushed her aside, like a medal locked in a drawer. He looked at the jet with something close to affection. But she deserved more than that. She wasn't just a machine. She was a partner. Lila felt a lump rise in her throat. I want to bring her back, she said firmly. Not for war, but to make her fly again. To show everyone she still matters. The old pilot studied her for a long time. Then he smiled. Not the polite kind people give out of courtesy, but a deep, heartfelt smile that comes from seeing something rare. You remind me of me, he said quietly. Back when I first climbed into that cockpit. Everyone told me I wasn't ready. Too young, too reckless. But this jet, he patted the fuselage again. She believed in me, even when no one else did. They sat in silence for a while. Dust motes danced in the air, and the hangar felt less empty now, as if the past itself had come to sit beside them. Finally, Captain Harris spoke again. There's something I never got to do, he said. My last mission, it was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance run. But things went wrong. We were hit, and I barely made it back alive. The day I landed her here was the day I walked away from the cockpit. I told myself I was done. But I never really said goodbye. He looked at Lila then, his eyes glistening. If you can get her flying again, I want to see her soar one last time. That's all I ask. That's my last wish. The weight of his words settled over Lila's heart. This wasn't just about restoring a forgotten machine anymore. This was about finishing a story that had been paused decades ago. And for the first time, she realized the true importance of what she was doing. I'll do it, she said firmly. I promise you, Captain Harris. She'll fly again. The old man's eyes softened. Then I'll be here, he said. Every step of the way. If you'll have an old pilot's help. From that day on, Captain Harris visited the hangar often. He brought with him stories of missions that had shaped history, of friends who had never returned, of nights spent above the clouds with nothing but stars and adrenaline for company. And he brought knowledge too, detailed explanations of how the jet's systems had worked, what to check, what to adjust, and why. Lila absorbed every word. With his help, she began to understand the aircraft in ways no manual could teach. She learned how the controls had felt in his hands, how the engine had sounded when pushed to its limits, how the jet had responded like a living thing when treated with respect. Together, they worked side by side, the young mechanic with dreams in her eyes and the old pilot with decades of memories etched into his soul. And slowly, piece by piece, the fighter jet came closer to rebirth. Sometimes, they would pause and just stand there in silence, looking at the aircraft that had connected their two worlds. And in those moments, it was as if time folded in on itself, the past and present woven together by shared purpose. One evening, as they closed up the hangar, Captain Harris rested a hand on Lila's shoulder. You're doing something special, he said. You're not just fixing a machine. You're preserving a piece of history. You're giving her, and me, a second chance. Lila smiled, her heart full. Then let's make sure we finish it. And as the hangar lights dimmed and the old jet rested quietly in the shadows, it was no longer just a forgotten relic. It was a promise of one last flight, one final chapter, and a legacy waiting to take to the skies once more. The morning air was crisp and still, the kind that carried the faint scent of rain and new beginnings. After months of tireless work, the old hangar no longer felt like a graveyard of forgotten metal. It felt alive, like a heartbeat pulsing beneath its steel walls. And at its center, gleaming under the soft light of dawn, stood the fighter jet that had once been left to rust and fade. She was beautiful now. Her once peeling paint had been lovingly restored, her wings strengthened, her engine rebuilt piece by piece. Lila had polished every panel until it reflected the world around it, not as a relic of the past, but as something reborn. The fighter jet no longer looked like a forgotten machine. She looked like she was ready to fly. Lila stood a few feet away, wiping her hands nervously on her overalls. She'd been up all night checking and rechecking every part. Every bolt was tight, every wire secure. But still, her heart pounded with anticipation and fear. This wasn't just a test of her skills as a mechanic anymore. This was a promise she'd made to the machine, and to Captain Harris. Are you ready? Came a familiar voice behind her. She turned and saw Captain Harris walking toward her, his steps slower now but steady, his posture straighter than she'd ever seen it. He was dressed in his old flight jacket, the one that still bore his squadron's faded insignia, and in his eyes burned the same light she imagined had once guided him through the clouds. "As ready as I'll ever be," Lila said with a shaky smile. He stopped beside her and stared at the jet in silence. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Every rivet, every repaired line, every drop of sweat Lila had poured into this machine was a word in a story they had written together. "She looks just like I remember," Harris murmured at last, his voice soft and reverent. "No, better. Like she's been waiting for this day as long as I have." Lila swallowed the lump in her throat. "Then let's not keep her waiting any longer." They climbed into position, Lila in the maintenance bay to oversee the startup sequence, and Harris into the cockpit. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the controls, but his movements were sure and practiced, like muscle memory waking from a long sleep. "Feels like coming home," he said, his voice crackling through the comms. "Then let's bring her home," Lila replied. She took a deep breath and flipped the master power switch. The hangar filled with a low hum as electricity coursed through the jet's veins. The control panels lit up, one by one, their lights blinking in sequence. Harris' fingers danced across the switches with precision, each movement unlocking another piece of the machine's dormant soul. "Fuel pressure steady," he reported. "Hydraulics reading green. Let's see if she remembers how to breathe." Lila nodded and engaged the starter. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, a heavy, breathless pause, and then the engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. The sound shook the hangar walls. It wasn't smooth at first, but it was real. It was alive. Lila's heart soared as the once-dead engine settled into a steady, powerful rhythm. She looked up and saw Harris gripping the controls with tears glistening in his eyes. "She's awake," he whispered. "She's ready," Lila said. The hangar doors rumbled open, revealing the vast stretch of runway beyond. The morning sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, a perfect backdrop for what was about to happen. With a gentle push on the throttle, Harris guided the fighter jet forward. The wheels rolled across the ground, hesitant at first, then stronger, steadier, as if remembering the feel of Earth. Beneath them, Lila jogged alongside for a few steps before stopping at the hangar's edge, watching with bated breath. "Control surfaces responding," Harris said through the comms. "Brakes good, steering good." He paused, then laughed softly, the sound trembling with joy. "She wants to fly." "Then let her," Lila replied, her voice breaking. The jet taxied down the runway, slow at first, then faster. Harris pushed the throttle forward, and the roar deepened. Wind whipped past the fuselage as the aircraft surged ahead, gaining speed with every heartbeat. Lila's hands clenched into fists. This was the moment. This was everything they had worked for. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on." At 80 knots, the nose began to lift. The front wheels left the ground. And then, with a final surge of power and a triumphant roar, the old fighter jet broke free of the earth and rose into the sky. Lila gasped. Her breath caught as she watched the aircraft climb higher and higher, sunlight glinting off its polished wings. It wasn't just a machine anymore, it was a memory, a dream, a piece of history reborn. "She's flying," Harris said, his voice trembling with emotion. "After all these years, she's flying." From the ground, Lila watched as the jet banked gracefully, circling the airfield in a wide arc. It moved with surprising agility, cutting through the morning air as if it had never forgotten the sky. And in that moment, Lila wasn't just watching a machine, she was watching a miracle. "This is where we belonged," Harris said softly, his voice distant, like he was speaking to someone far away. "Up here, together." For a while, he simply flew, no missions, no battles, no orders. Just flight, just freedom. It was as if time had rolled back, and he was young again, and the jet was new, and the sky belonged to them. Then, after what felt like both a heartbeat and a lifetime, he turned the jet back toward the airfield. The landing was smooth, almost effortless, the kind of landing only a pilot who truly knew his aircraft could manage. When the wheels kissed the ground and the jet slowed to a halt, the air was thick with silence, a reverence too deep for words. The canopy opened, and Harris climbed out slowly. He stood on the wing for a long moment, staring at the horizon. Lila hurried toward him, her heart pounding, her eyes stinging with tears she didn't try to hide. "You did it," she said breathlessly. "You both did." He turned to her with a smile that was soft and bittersweet. No, he said, we did. They stood side by side, looking at the jet that had brought them together, the girl who had believed she could fix anything and the man who had once thought his flying days were over. And as the wind rustled across the runway and the morning sun climbed higher, Lila realized something important: this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Captain Harris placed a hand gently on the fuselage. Thank you, he whispered, both to Lila and to the machine that had carried him one last time. I can go now, knowing she's not forgotten. Lila swallowed hard. She never will be. Not while I'm here. And with that, the story of the forgotten fighter jet, once abandoned and left to rust, became something more. It became a story of resilience and legacy, of youth and age, of dreams reborn and promises kept. It became their story, and as the sun rose higher over the runway, casting its golden light across the base, the old fighter jet gleamed brighter than it ever had, not as a relic of the past, but as a symbol of everything that refused to be